The shuttle was falling apart around Nathan Cole as fire consumed the cockpit and smoke filled his lungs with each desperate breath he tried to take. And he knew with terrible certainty that he was going to die on this unknown world, far from everything he had ever loved or known. He had been a xenobiologist aboard the human exploration vessel called Horizon's Edge for nearly 3 years, studying alien life forms and cataloging species that no human had ever seen before. And his work had taken him to dozens of planets across the galaxy. But none of them had tried to kill him quite like this one was doing right now. The planet was called Draonus Prime in the old star charts. And it was supposed to be a simple survey mission where he would collect samples and return to the ship before dinner. But something had gone wrong with the navigation systems, and his shuttle had been pulled into the atmosphere by forces he could not understand or control. Nathan gripped the emergency handles as the ground rushed up to meet him, and he closed his eyes and thought about his mother back on Earth, and his sister who had always told him that space exploration would be the death of him. And it seemed she had been right all along. The impact was violent and loud and painful beyond anything he had ever experienced. And then there was nothing but darkness and silence and the distant sound of something large moving through the wreckage around him. When Nathan opened his eyes again, he was no longer in the shuttle, but in a massive stone chamber lit by torches that burned with blue flames. And the ceiling above him was so high that he could barely see it in the flickering light. His body ached in ways he had never imagined possible, and when he tried to sit up, a voice spoke from the shadows in a language that his translator struggled to process before finally rendering the words into something he could understand. "Do not move, small creature, for your bones are broken and your flesh is torn, and you will only make your injuries worse if you try to stand." Nathan turned his head slowly and saw her for the first time, and his breath caught in his throat as his mind struggled to process what his eyes were showing him. She was enormous, standing nearly 15 feet tall with scales that shimmered like molten copper in the torchlight. And her eyes were golden and ancient and filled with a sadness that seemed to stretch back centuries. And her wings were folded against her back like great leather capes. And her claws were longer than his forearms. And she was the most terrifying and beautiful thing he had ever seen in his entire life. "What are you?" Nathan whispered, his voice cracking from the smoke he had inhaled during the crash. "I am Kirathine of the House of Eternal Flame, last daughter of a dying bloodline. Warrior of the Draanari people," she answered. And her voice was like thunder wrapped in silk, deep and powerful yet somehow gentle. "And the question I should ask is, what are you, small thing? For I had never seen a creature quite like you before." Nathan tried to explain that he was human, that he came from a planet called Earth, that he meant no harm and was only a scientist studying the universe. But the words came out jumbled and confused because his head was spinning and his vision kept blurring at the edges. Kirathine moved closer, and each step she took made the stone floor tremble beneath her weight. And she knelt beside him with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. And she placed one massive clawed hand against his chest with a gentleness that surprised him. "Your heart beats fast like a frightened animal," she observed. "But there is something else there too, something I have not sensed in a very long time. And I think perhaps the old gods have sent you to me for a reason I do not yet understand." Over the following weeks, Nathan healed slowly under Kirathine's care, and she brought him food and water and medicine made from plants that grew in her mountain fortress. And she sat with him for hours, asking questions about Earth and humanity and the strange little species that had somehow crawled out of the mud and reached the stars. The Draanari, she explained, had ruled this region of space for thousands of years. And they had watched countless species rise and fall. And they had always considered humans to be insignificant creatures not worth their attention. Too small and too weak, and too fragile to matter in the grand scheme of galactic affairs. But Nathan was not like what she had expected, and he made her laugh with his strange jokes and his curious observations. And he showed no fear in her presence, even though she could crush him with a single careless movement of her tail. "You are very brave for something so tiny," Kirathine told him one evening as they sat together watching the twin moons rise over the mountains. "Or perhaps you are very foolish, for most creatures run from the Draanari and hide in shadows and pray we do not notice them." Nathan smiled and shook his head, telling her that humans had learned long ago that running from danger rarely saved them, and that the only way his people had survived their brutal homeworld was by facing their fears and finding ways to overcome them. "Earth sounds like a terrible place," Kirathine said, with something that might have been admiration in her golden eyes. "It was," Nathan agreed, "and that is exactly why we became what we are. For our world tried to kill us every single day, and we refused to let it win." As the weeks turned into months, Nathan grew stronger, and Kirathine grew fonder of his company. And she began to share things with him that she had never shared with anyone before. Secrets and sorrows that she had carried alone for centuries. Her council of elders did not approve of the human living in her fortress, and they sent messages demanding that she cast him out or deliver him to them for study. But Kirathine ignored their commands and continued to shelter Nathan from their curiosity and their cruelty. "Why do you protect me?" Nathan asked her one night when the storms raged outside and lightning painted the sky in shades of purple and white. "I am nothing to your people, just a small creature from a world they have never cared about." Kirathine was silent for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it before. "Because you look at me and you see me," she answered. "Not a weapon, not a symbol, not a political tool to be used and discarded, but me, Kirathine, just a woman who has been alone for far too long. And that is worth more than you can possibly imagine." Nathan reached out and placed his small hand against her massive scaled arm, and he felt the warmth of her blood pulsing beneath the surface. And he understood that despite all their differences in size and species and history, they were not so different after all. Something was beginning between them, something strange and unexpected and possibly impossible, but neither of them was ready to name it yet. For some things need time to grow before they can be spoken aloud. The truth came out on a cold night when the winds howled through the mountain passes and Kirathine sat alone by the fire with tears streaming down her scaled face. And Nathan found her there and knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. "What has happened?" he asked, moving to sit beside her massive form. And she did not answer at first, but only stared into the flames as if searching for something that had been lost long ago. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with grief and shame and a despair so deep that Nathan felt it in his own chest like a physical weight pressing down upon his heart. "My people are dying," Kirathine said, and the words seemed to cost her everything to speak. "Not from war or disease or any enemy we can fight, but from something far worse. Something we did to ourselves without ever understanding the consequences." Nathan listened as she explained the terrible curse that had befallen the Draanari race, and with each word she spoke, his understanding of her sorrow grew deeper and more complete. The Draanari had evolved over millions of years to become the most powerful beings in their region of space, growing larger and stronger and more fearsome with each passing generation. And they had taken pride in their size and their strength and their ability to crush any enemy who dared to challenge them. But evolution, Kirathine told him, does not care about pride or power or the desires of those it shapes. And the same changes that had made her people into giants had also made reproduction almost impossible for them to achieve. Female Draanari could only safely produce offspring with males whose genetic markers matched specific patterns. And as the population had grown smaller and the bloodlines had narrowed, Compatible mates had become rarer and rarer until now there were almost none left at all. "I am the last of my house," Kirathine said, and her claws dug into the stone floor as she spoke, leaving deep gouges in the ancient rock. "And I have been pressured for 300 years to produce an heir, to continue the bloodline that has existed since before your species learned to walk upright. But my body refuses every male they bring before me." She turned to look at Nathan, and her golden eyes were filled with a pain that made him want to weep for her. "My body is too big to procreate," she said, and the words were bitter on her tongue. "That is what the healers tell me, that my form has grown beyond what nature intended, that I am a dead end, a failure, the last leaf on a tree that will never bloom again." Nathan sat in silence as the full weight of her words settled over him, and he understood now why she had seemed so sad when they first met, why her eyes held centuries of sorrow, why she had latched onto his company with such desperate need. She was not just lonely. She was watching her entire species fade into extinction, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Have your people tried anything?" Nathan asked, his scientific mind already turning over possibilities and solutions. "Genetic modification, artificial breeding, anything at all?" Kirathine shook her head slowly, explaining that the Draanari were proud and stubborn and set in their ways, and they believed that nature should not be tampered with, that if they were meant to survive, then they would survive, and if not, then they would accept their fate with dignity. "That is foolish," Nathan said, before he could stop himself, and Kirathine looked at him with surprise at his boldness. "No species should accept extinction when there might be options they have not explored." "What options could there be?" Kirathine asked, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes that might have been hope. "We have searched for compatible mates across every world we know, and there are none left who match what my biology requires." Nathan was quiet for a long moment, thinking about everything he had learned in his years as a xenobiologist, and a crazy idea began to form in the back of his mind. An idea so wild and impossible that he almost dismissed it immediately. But then he remembered something his mentor had told him back on Earth, that humans were the most adaptable species anyone had ever discovered, that their genetic code was flexible in ways that defied explanation, that they could bond with and adapt to almost anything the universe threw at them. "I need to study your biology," Nathan said finally, and Kirathine tilted her massive head in confusion at his request. "I need samples, data, everything you can give me about how Draanari reproduction works, because I have a theory that I need to test." Kirathine agreed, though she did not understand what he hoped to find. And over the following weeks, Nathan threw himself into research with an intensity that surprised even himself. He worked through the nights, comparing Draanari genetic structures with human ones, analyzing cellular compatibility and reproductive mechanisms, and the more he learned, the more excited he became. The problem, he discovered, was not that Draanari females were too large to reproduce. The problem was that their genetic code had become too rigid, too specialized, too locked into specific patterns that required exact matches to function properly. But human genetic material was different, wonderfully and beautifully different, because humans had evolved on a world that changed constantly, a world of ice ages and heat waves and mass extinctions. And the only way to survive such chaos was to become infinitely adaptable. Human cells, Nathan realized with growing excitement, could bond with almost any compatible alien genome because they were designed by evolution to be flexible, to change, to find ways to work with whatever they encountered. The size difference between humans and Draanari was irrelevant at the cellular level, he discovered, because reproduction did not depend on physical compatibility, but on genetic compatibility. And humans possessed something that no one in the galaxy had ever properly appreciated. They were not weak or insignificant. They were the ultimate adapters, capable of bridging gaps that other species could not even imagine crossing. Nathan burst into Kirathine's chambers one morning with his data clutched in his hands and excitement burning in his eyes, and she rose from her seat with alarm at his sudden entrance. "I found it," he shouted, waving the papers at her. "I found the answer, Kirathine. And it has been right in front of everyone this whole time. And no one ever thought to look because they were all too proud and too blind to see it." Kirathine stared at him with confusion and hope warring in her golden eyes, and she asked him to explain what he meant in words she could understand. Nathan took a deep breath and spoke the truth that would change everything. "Humans and Draanari are compatible," he said, and the words hung in the air between them like a promise and a challenge and a door opening onto a future neither of them had ever dared to imagine. "And I can prove it." Kirathine stared at Nathan as if he had lost his mind completely, and for a long moment she could not find any words to respond to what he had just told her. "That is impossible," she finally said, shaking her massive head so that her copper scales caught the light and sparkled like flames dancing on water. "Humans are tiny creatures, fragile things that break if you hold them too tightly. And the Draanari are ancient and powerful, beyond anything your young species can comprehend." But Nathan was not discouraged by her doubt, and he spread his research across the table before her, pointing to charts and diagrams and genetic sequences that he had spent weeks analyzing and comparing. "Look at this," he said, tapping a chart that showed the structure of human cells next to Draanari cells. "Your people think that size determines compatibility, but that is not how biology works at the level that matters most." He explained his findings in simple terms, knowing that Kirathine was a warrior and not a scientist, and he watched her golden eyes move across the data as she struggled to understand what he was showing her. Human genetic material, he told her, was unlike anything else in the Gnome Galaxy because it had evolved under conditions of constant change and chaos. And this had given humans a remarkable ability to adapt to almost any environment or situation they encountered. "Your species evolved to become stronger and larger," Nathan said. "But my species evolved to become more flexible. And flexibility is exactly what your rigid Draanari genetics need to produce viable offspring." Kirathine was silent for a long time, and Nathan could see the war playing out behind her ancient eyes as hope battled against centuries of disappointment and grief. "Even if what you say is true," she said slowly, "and I am not saying that I believe you yet, what would it mean for us, for the Draanari? If our salvation came from a species we have always dismissed as inferior and worthless?" Nathan smiled at her question, because it revealed something important about how the Draanari viewed the universe and their place within it. "Perhaps it would mean that you were wrong about humans," he said gently. "And perhaps being wrong is not such a terrible thing when the alternative is extinction." Kirathine rose from her seat and walked to the window, her massive form blocking out the light as she stared across the mountains that had been her home for centuries. And when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I have watched my brothers die without heirs," she said. "I have held my sisters as they wept over eggs that would never hatch. I have attended funerals for bloodlines that stretched back to the dawn of our civilization. And I accepted that I would be next, that my house would end with me, and there was nothing I could do to prevent it." She turned back to face Nathan, and he saw tears forming in her golden eyes, crystalline drops that caught the light like diamonds as they rolled down her scaled cheeks. "If there is even the smallest chance that you are right," Kirathine continued, "then I would be a fool to ignore it, and whatever the cost to my pride or my position, I must at least consider what you are suggesting." Nathan nodded and asked if she was willing to run more tests, to provide additional samples that would allow him to prove his theory beyond any doubt. And Kirathine agreed with a determination in her eyes that he had not seen before. Over the following days, They worked together in her private chambers. And Nathan taught her about human biology, while she taught him about Draanari physiology. And with each new piece of information they discovered, his confidence in his theory grew stronger. The compatibility was not just possible. It was almost perfect, as if nature itself had designed humans to be the missing piece that the Draanari needed to survive. How can this be? Kirathine asked one evening as they reviewed the latest results. How can your tiny species be the answer to a problem that has plagued us for thousands of years? Nathan thought about her question carefully before answering, because he wanted her to understand something important about humanity and their place in the universe. On Earth, he began, we have a saying that what does not kill you makes you stronger. And our planet tried very hard to kill us for millions of years before we finally escaped into space. He told her about the ice ages that had frozen the world and forced humans to adapt or die. About the predators that had hunted them and the diseases that had ravaged their populations. About the volcanoes and earthquakes and floods that had destroyed their homes again and again. Every challenge we faced changed us, Nathan explained. Not by making us bigger or stronger like your people, but by making us more flexible, more creative, more able to find solutions to problems that seemed impossible to solve. Kirathine listened with growing wonder as he spoke, and she began to see humanity in a new light. Not as weak creatures to be pitied, but as survivors who had endured horrors that would have destroyed lesser species. Your people have looked at us and seen only our small size and our soft bodies, Nathan said, but they never looked deeper. Never realized that the very traits they dismissed as weaknesses were actually our greatest strengths. He reached out and took her massive clawed hand in both of his, feeling the warmth of her blood pulsing beneath her scales, and he looked up into her golden eyes with a courage that surprised even himself. I believe this can work, he said. I believe that I can give you the air your bloodline needs. The child that your people have told you is impossible, but only if you are willing to trust me, to take a chance on something that has never been tried before. Kirathine stared down at him, this tiny human who had crashed into her life and turned everything she thought she knew upside down, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Something that had been frozen for centuries beginning to thaw. The council will never accept this, she said, but there was no rejection in her voice, only a statement of fact that they both knew to be true. Then we will make them accept it, Nathan replied, squeezing her hand gently, because if I have learned anything in my life, it is that humans do not give up, and we do not let others tell us what is possible or impossible. Kirathine laughed then, a deep rumbling sound that shook the walls of her chamber and made Nathan's heart soar with joy. You are either the bravest creature I have ever met, she said, or the most foolish, and I am not entirely certain which one it is. Nathan grinned up at her and shrugged his shoulders. Perhaps I am both, he admitted, and perhaps that is exactly what you need. The council chamber was enormous, carved from black stone that seemed to swallow the light from the torches lining the walls. And Nathan felt incredibly small as he stood before the 7 elders who ruled the Draanari people. Each elder was massive, even by Draanari standards. Ancient beings with scales that had faded to gray and silver with age. And their eyes were cold and hard as they looked down upon the tiny human who dared to stand in their presence. Kirathine stood beside Nathan, her copper scales gleaming defiantly in the torchlight, and she held herself tall and proud despite the obvious disapproval radiating from the council members. You bring this creature before us with claims that insult our intelligence and our heritage. The eldest of the council spoke, his voice like rocks grinding together in an avalanche. And you expect us to believe that a human can do what no Draanari male has been able to accomplish? I expect you to look at the evidence, Kirathine replied, her voice steady and strong. And I expect you to consider the possibility that we have been wrong about humans all along. The council erupted into angry murmurs and growls, and several of the elders slammed their tails against the floor in displays of fury that made the entire chamber shake. Nathan stood his ground, despite the terror coursing through his veins, remembering what he had told Kirathine about humans refusing to give up even when facing impossible odds. "If I may speak," he said, and his voice sounded impossibly small in the vast chamber. But it was enough to silence the angry elders, who turned their attention to him with expressions ranging from disgust to curiosity. "You may speak, tiny thing," the eldest elder said with contempt dripping from every word. "Though I cannot imagine what you could possibly say that would change our minds about this foolishness." Nathan took a deep breath and began to explain his research, speaking clearly and simply so that even those who knew nothing about genetics could understand what he had discovered. He told them about human adaptability, about the millions of years of evolution that had shaped his species into something unique in the galaxy, about the flexibility of human genetic material and its remarkable ability to bond with other compatible genomes. The elders listened in silence, their expressions unreadable, and when Nathan finished speaking, the chamber was so quiet that he could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. "You speak pretty words," another elder finally said, a female with scales of tarnished bronze and eyes like frozen amber. "But words prove nothing, and we will not allow our noble sister to disgrace herself based on the theories of an inferior creature." "Then let me prove it," Nathan said, and his voice grew stronger as determination replaced his fear. "Give me a chance to demonstrate that I am worthy, and if I fail, I will accept whatever punishment you decide." The elders conferred among themselves in low growls and hisses that Nathan's translator could not quite process. And finally, the eldest turned back to face him with something that might have been a cruel smile on his ancient face. "Very well, human," he said. "We will give you the chance you asked for. But be warned that the trials you must face were designed for Draanari warriors, and no creature of your size has ever survived them." Kirathine started to protest, but Nathan placed his hand on her arm and shook his head gently. "I accept," he said, and he tried not to think about what he might be getting himself into. The trials began the next morning, and they were every bit as brutal as the elders had promised. The first trial was a test of endurance, where Nathan had to cross a frozen mountain pass that would have been challenging even for a Draanari, and the wind cut through him like knives made of ice as he struggled forward, step by painful step. But Nathan had grown up on Earth, where humans had survived ice ages that lasted thousands of years, and he knew how to conserve his body heat and pace himself through the brutal cold. He emerged from the pass battered and exhausted but alive, and the elders watched with something like surprise in their ancient eyes. The second trial was a test of intellect, where Nathan had to solve puzzles that had been designed to challenge the greatest Draanari minds. And the problems were presented in ways that assumed he would have claws and wings and a body 3 times his actual size. But Nathan did not try to solve the puzzles the way a Draanari would. Instead, he approached them as a human, finding creative solutions that the puzzle makers had never anticipated. He used his small size to access passages that were meant to be decorative rather than functional. And he combined tools in ways that the Draanari had never considered, because their massive forms made such combinations unnecessary. When he completed the final puzzle in half the expected time, the elders could no longer hide their amazement. The third and final trial was a test of courage, where Nathan had to face a creature called a shadow drake, a beast that fed on fear and grew stronger when its prey was terrified. The shadow drake was released into an arena, and Nathan stood alone in the center as the massive creature circled him, its body made of darkness and its eyes burning with hungry fire. The elders expected him to run or to freeze or to collapse in terror, but Nathan did something that none of them had anticipated. He stood perfectly still and forced himself to feel no fear at all, not because he was brave, but because he understood that fear was what gave the creature its power. He thought about Kirathine and the hope in her golden eyes, about the child they might have together, about a future where humans and Draanari stood side by side as allies and partners. The shadow drake circled closer and closer, but Nathan refused to be afraid and without fear to feed on. The creature grew weaker and smaller until it was nothing but a wisp of darkness that faded away into nothing. The chamber fell silent as the elders processed what they had just witnessed, and then Kirathine let out a roar of triumph that shook the very foundations of the mountain. "He has passed the trials," she declared, her voice ringing with pride and joy. "And by your own laws, you must accept him as worthy." The eldest elder rose from his seat, and for a long moment Nathan feared that he would reject the results and find some excuse to deny them. But instead, the ancient Draanari bowed his head, a gesture of respect that Nathan had never expected to see. "You have proven yourself human," he said, "and perhaps we have been blind to the true nature of your species for far too long." That night, under the twin moons of Draonus Prime, Nathan and Kirathine bonded in a ceremony that had never been performed before. A union between dragon and human that would change the course of galactic history. And when they came together, two beings of vastly different sizes and species and histories, something miraculous happened that proved Nathan's theory beyond any possible doubt. Life began. The months that followed were filled with wonder and worry in equal measure, as Kirathine's body began to change in ways that no Draanari female had experienced in over 300 years. Nathan stayed by her side through every moment, monitoring her condition with instruments he had salvaged from his crash shuttle and combined with Draanari medical technology. The council watched from a distance, their earlier hostility slowly giving way to cautious hope as the signs became unmistakable. "Can you feel it?" Kirathine asked Nathan one evening as they sat together in her chambers, and she placed his small hand against her scaled belly where something was growing inside her. Nathan pressed his palm against the warmth of her scales and felt a flutter of movement beneath. A tiny life that was half human and half Draanari and entirely miraculous. "I feel it," he whispered, and his eyes filled with tears that he did not try to hide. "Our child is growing strong." Kirathine wrapped her massive tail around him gently and pulled him closer, and she lowered her great head until her forehead touched his. "I never believed this was possible," she admitted. "Even when you showed me your research and proved the compatibility, part of me still thought it was just a dream that would fade away when I woke up." Nathan kissed her scaled snout and smiled up at her golden eyes. "Humans have a talent for making impossible dreams come true," he said. "It is one of our most annoying and wonderful qualities." When the time finally came, the entire Draanari nation seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Kirathine laid a single egg in her chamber, surrounded by healers and witnesses and council members who had gathered to see if the miracle was real. The egg was unlike any that had been seen before, its shell shimmering with copper scales like its mother, but swirled with patterns of softer color that reminded Nathan of human skin. "It is beautiful," Kirathine breathed, her voice filled with exhaustion and wonder as she curled her body protectively around the precious treasure she had created. Nathan sat beside her through the long days that followed, keeping watch over the egg as it developed and changed. And he told stories to the life growing inside about Earth and humanity, and all the adventures they would have together. The council came often to check on the egg's progress, and Nathan noticed that their attitudes had shifted completely from the hostility they had shown when he first arrived. "We owe you an apology, human," the eldest elder said one day, his ancient voice softer than Nathan had ever heard it before. "We judged your species unfairly, and we almost missed the greatest gift the universe has ever offered us." Nathan accepted the apology graciously, knowing that it must have cost the proud elder dearly to admit he had been wrong. When the egg finally began to crack, Nathan called for Kirathine to wake from her rest. and they watched together as tiny claws broke through the shell from inside. The hatching took hours, and with each new crack in the shell, Nathan's heart beat faster with anticipation and love. Finally, the last piece of shell fell away, and there she was, their daughter, a being unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen before. She was smaller than a pure Draanari child would have been, perhaps only 4 feet tall, but she had her mother's copper scales and wings that could fold neatly against her back. Her eyes were golden like Kirathine's, but they held a spark of curiosity and adaptability that Nathan recognized from his own reflection. Her hands were clawed but delicate, capable of the fine manipulation that humans use to build and create, and her tail was long and graceful and already twitching with energy. "She is perfect," Kirathine whispered, and crystalline tears rolled down her scaled face as she reached out to touch their daughter for the first time. Nathan picked up the tiny hybrid child, marveling at how light she felt in his arms, despite her scales and her wings. And she looked up at him with eyes that seemed to understand everything, even though she had just entered the world. "Hello, little one," he said softly. "I am your father, and I am going to teach you everything I know about being human and brave and stubborn and full of hope." The child made a sound that was part Draanari rumble and part human coo, and Nathan laughed with joy at the beautiful noise. Word spread quickly across Draonus Prime and then across the galaxy, carried by traders and travelers and diplomatic envoys who could not believe what they were hearing. A human had done what no other species could do. A human had saved the Draanari from extinction. Requests began pouring in from other worlds, from other dying species who had given up hope, asking if humans might be compatible with them as well. Scientists and geneticists across the galaxy suddenly became very interested in Earth and its supposedly insignificant inhabitants, and the studies they conducted revealed what Nathan had already discovered. Humans were not weak or inferior. They were the most adaptable species anyone had ever encountered. Genetic bridges capable of connecting with almost any compatible form of life. The implications were staggering, and Nathan watched with pride as his tiny species suddenly became the most sought-after partners in the known universe. "You have changed everything," Kirathine told him one night as they watched their daughter take her first wobbling flight around the chamber, her small wings beating furiously to keep her aloft. "Not just for me, not just for the Draanari, but for the entire galaxy." Nathan smiled and leaned against her massive, warm body, feeling her heartbeat against his back. "Humans have been changing things since we first figured out how to make fire," he said. "It is what we do best." Their daughter landed clumsily beside them and immediately climbed into Nathan's lap, her tiny claws careful not to scratch him as she curled up against his chest. "What will her life be like?" Kirathine asked, looking down at the precious child they had created together. "She belongs to 2 worlds that have never been connected before." Nathan stroked his daughter's scaled head gently and thought about the future that stretched out before them. "She will be a bridge," he said finally, "just like her father, connecting things that others thought could never be joined, showing the galaxy that differences are not weaknesses, but strengths waiting to be discovered." Kirathine nodded slowly, and her golden eyes shone with a happiness that Nathan had never seen in her before. Somewhere out in the void, other humans were learning about what had happened on Draonus Prime, and they were beginning to understand their true place in the universe. They were not the smallest or the strongest or the oldest species in the galaxy, but they were something far more important. They were the adapters, the connectors, the bridge builders who could unite worlds that had never dreamed of being joined. And as Nathan held his sleeping daughter close and felt Kirathine's warmth surrounding them both, he knew that this was only the beginning of humanity's true story among the stars. The universe had finally noticed the tiny creatures from Earth, and nothing would ever be the same again.